Picture the ship the way the sagas want you to. Sunlight on the oars, a dragon prow throwing a shadow across the water, a sail like a wall of red and white wool, filling until the whole hull leans and runs. It's beautiful. It's also a spreadsheet. Every plank in it is a felled oak. Every rivet is a trip to the forge. Every single meter of that gorgeous sail is a year of some woman's hands. Before the ship ever frightens a soul, it has already ruined someone financially. So let's do the thing the sagas never do. Let's read the invoice. You already know the Viking. You've met him 100 times. He comes over the side of the boat with an axe and a scream. He takes the gold and the silver. He burns the church, and he leaves. He is violence with a beard. He is chaos that happens to other people. That's the picture. And the picture is not wrong exactly. It's just the last 4 minutes of a story that took 10 years and a small fortune to set up. Because here is the thing nobody puts on the poster. The axe in his hand was cheap. Any farmer owned iron. The scream was free. The thing that actually made him dangerous, the thing without which he is just an angry man on a beach far from home, cost more than his entire farm and took the better part of a decade to build. History hands you the raider and quietly hides the balance sheet behind him. And once you find that balance sheet, the whole Viking Age stops looking like a horror story and starts looking like something much stranger. An investment. One that paid off catastrophically for about 300 years, and then in the year 1066 stopped paying at all. So here's the flip. The Vikings were not primarily warriors who happened to have boats. They were boat owners who could, when the numbers made sense, choose to become warriors. That is a completely different animal. A warrior is a cost. A boat is an asset that could trade, explore, carry settlers, haul, cargo, and raid, all with the same hull and the same crew, switching from one to the next depending on which was more profitable that season. The axe was a tool the ship carried. The ship was the actual weapon and the actual business. For everyone else in early medieval Europe, the sea was a wall. It was the thing that stopped you, the edge of the map, the reason a rich monastery on a quiet coast could sleep soundly at night. For the Vikings, the same sea was a road. Here's what I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you the mechanism, not just the myth. I'm going to show you exactly what one of these ships cost to build, down to the trees and the sheep. I'm going to show you who fronted the money and how the loot got split. I'm going to show you what the ship actually bought, which was never only gold. And then I'm going to show you the part that almost nobody tells you, which is how the exact feature that made this machine unstoppable is the same feature that, in the end, quietly killed it. Because a road, it turns out, runs both directions. Before we tear this thing apart, you have to understand how genuinely brilliant it was. Not brutal, brilliant. The Longship solved a problem that had stopped everyone else cold, and it solved it with an elegance that engineers still admire 1,000 years later. The problem was reach. If you were a poor community on the cold rim of the north, the wealth of the world was maddeningly visible and completely out of range. There were monasteries fat with silver, trading towns thick with goods, kingdoms with more grain in one storehouse than your whole valley grew in a year, and all of it sat behind water you couldn't cross in force. The Longship erased that water. It sat so shallow in the sea that it could cross open ocean and then, without stopping, run straight up a river or slide onto a flat beach, no harbor required. That one trick changed everything. It meant you didn't have to attack the defended port. You could appear behind it, inland, at the soft, undefended places nobody thought to guard, because nobody thought a seagoing ship could get there. And it was fast. The great longships could hold 6 to 8 knots for hour after hour under sail, and sprint far quicker when they had to, which meant they arrived before the warning did. Think about what that does to a defender. You cannot fortify a coastline. You cannot guard every river mouth and every beach at once. The ship let a small band choose the time and the place and the target, take what it came for, and be gone over the horizon before the local lord had even finished saddling his horse. Surprise, in military terms, is worth more than numbers, and the longship manufactured surprise the way a mill manufactures flour, steadily, reliably, on demand. And here is the part that turns a rating tool into an economic engine. The very same ship, with the sail furled and the shield stowed, was a cargo vessel. The very same crew, with the season changed, were merchants or explorers, or a family of settlers with their livestock aboard looking for empty land. One asset, 4 business models. You could raid a coast in the spring, trade along it in the summer, scout a new river in the autumn, and carry colonists to it the following year and never buy a second ship to do any of it. That is not the profile of a barbarian. That is the profile of an extraordinarily flexible investment. And reach didn't stop at the coastline. Turn the ship east instead of west, and the same shallow hull that could climb a river could, when the river finally ran out, be dragged bodily overland to the next one. The northern crews hauled their boats across the portages between the great Russian rivers and rowed them all the way down to the Black Sea and the Caspian, until men who had been born on a fjord were trading and raiding at the walls of Constantinople and in the markets of the Islamic world. The silver that came back up those rivers, struck thousands of miles away in Baghdad and Samarkand, ended its journey buried in hoards on cold Baltic islands. Sit with the absurdity of that supply chain, because it tells you exactly what the asset was worth. The ship didn't just make the next kingdom reachable, it made the entire known world reachable, from a starting point that had almost nothing. That is the return on the machine before a single raid is even counted, which raises the obvious question, the one the sagas never ask. If the ship was the whole game, what did the ship actually cost? So let's follow a single one, from standing forest to the water, and add it up as it goes. Start with the wood, because the wood comes first, and the wood is not gentle on the land. To build one large longship, you do not go to a lumberyard. You go to a forest and you take it apart. A reconstruction of one of the great longships, built by modern craftsmen who measured everything, swallowed around 14 big oak trees, each roughly a meter thick at the trunk, call it 150 stacked cubic meters of timber, gone, for one hull. And not just any oaks. You need tall, straight ones for the planking and, crucially, ones that grew with the right natural curve for the ribs in the prow, because a Viking shipwright doesn't bend wood to a shape, he finds wood already grown into the shape and follows the grain. That means walking the forest and reading it like a catalog, and it means the good timber was a resource you could exhaust. Then, the iron. The hull is held together the clinker way, every plank overlapping the one below it, and every overlap fastened with iron rivets, thousands of them in a single ship, and every one of them forged by hand, one at a time, hammered hot, and clenched over a washer on the inside. There was no barrel of screws to buy. Each fastening in that hull represents a separate act of a blacksmith's labor, multiplied by thousands. And then, the sail. This is where the number that already sounds big turns out to be far bigger than you think. A longship's sail was wool, and wool at that scale is a monster. A single sail of around 100 square meters needed something like 2 tons of raw fleece, the entire year's wool from a flock of roughly 700 sheep, and that's just the raw material. The labor behind it is the part that stops you. Spinning that fleece into yarn and weaving it into sailcloth on an upright loom was so enormous a task that one modern replica sail took 2 skilled women 4.5 years to complete, hand spinning on the order of 165,000 meters of yarn along the way. 4.5 years. For the sail, not the ship the sail. Now stack it all up. The tally on one hull in modern reconstruction ran to something like 23 or 24,000 hours of skilled work. Sit with that. That is around a decade of one person's entire working life, poured into a single object, before it has carried one coin or frightened one monk. This was not something a lone farmer bought on a whim. This was the most expensive thing most communities would ever build. And here's a wrinkle in that one asset, four business models idea. Because the Vikings noticed it too. When archaeologists lifted 5 ships out of a single Danish fjord, they were not 5 copies of one boat. They were specialists, a lean, lethal warship, built only for speed and fighting men, sitting beside a fat, deep-bellied cargo hull, the Nair, built only to haul goods across open ocean. The flexible do-everything longship was where you started, but success bred specialization. Once the trade was rich enough, you commissioned a dedicated freighter, and once the raiding was serious enough, you commissioned a dedicated predator. Each one was its own decade of labor, and none of it could be hurried, because the oak had to be split and worked while it was still green, and the hull coaxed into shape over a season or more. You could not, in a crisis, simply buy your way to a fleet. You had to grow one, tree by tree and rivet by rivet, which is the surest sign of all that we are looking at, capital, not equipment. And that decade of labor is only the cost you can see. There's a second ledger, the one that never made it into any saga, and it's larger than the first. Start with the flock, and then zoom out from your one ship to the whole enterprise, because the sail cost isn't a quirk, it's a civilization-sized bill. By the middle of the 11th century, when the northern fleets were at their peak, the total sail carried by all those ships added up to something on the order of 1 million square meters of woven wool. To keep that much cloth in service, you needed the annual wool of somewhere around 2 million sheep, year after year, just for the sails. That is not a war economy sitting on top of a farming economy. That is a farming economy that has quietly reorganized half of itself to feed a fleet pastures, flocks, and the uncounted labor of thousands of women at the spindle and the loom, none of whom ever set foot on a raid, all of whom were essential to it. Now bring it back to your one ship and add the running costs. A great longship carried 65 to 70 men. Those men had to be fed on the voyage, which means barrels of provisions and fresh water hauled aboard and calculated against the length of the trip. Those men were not on their farms, which, for a community that lived on the edge, meant fields half-tended and harvests at risk every season the ship was out. And those men expected to be paid, not in wages, but in shares. Which brings us to the question that actually ran the whole system. Who paid for the ship in the first place? Because almost no individual could. The capital came from the top. A chieftain, a jarl, a wealthy landowner who could command the timber, the iron, and the years of labor, and who fronted that enormous cost the way a merchant fronts a trading voyage. He owned the ship. The crew signed on for a share of whatever the voyage brought back, which aligned everyone's incentives beautifully and brutally. The men rowed harder because they were, quite literally, rowing for their own cut. And the split was its own small piece of financial engineering. The owner who had sunk the capital took the largest share off the top, the way the man carrying the risk always does. What remained was divided among the crew, often by role and seniority. So, the veteran steersman drew more than the boy on his first voyage, a rough equity table written in silver and understood by everyone aboard before the ship ever cast off. That is worth pausing on, because it means a raiding crew was not a mob. It was closer to a company, shareholders, a payroll structure, and a very clear sense of who was owed what once the cargo was sold. And if the voyage failed, there was no insurance. There was no bailout. A failed voyage meant the crew's shares were nothing, the season's farm work was lost anyway, and the men who didn't come home didn't come home. The downside was total. And behind every man on that bench stood a whole household that never appears in the raid story at all. The wool for his sail was spun and woven by women whose years of labor bought them no share of the plunder. The farm he left was kept alive by the people who stayed. The provisions he ate were grown by a community that had gambled a season of its food on his voyage. When we say the ship cost a decade of labor, we are still understating it, because the true cost was distributed across an entire society that had bent itself, its forests, its flocks, its harvests, its people around the shape of these ships. The raider is the only part of the machine that gets remembered. He is also the smallest part of what it cost to put him on that beach. For everyone else, the sea was a wall. For them, it was a road. And every trip down that road was a bet with a man's whole life and half his village's year on the table. So the ship is built and financed and crewed, and it goes out, and now we come to the only question that matters to the men who paid for it. Did the bet pay? For a long time, spectacularly, yes, and the returns are where you finally see why anyone would build a decade of labor just to send it over the horizon. Gold and silver from a raid was the smallest part of it. The part that made the songs? The real returns were structural, and the first of them is the one the sagas are quietest about. People. A raid didn't only take treasure. It took human beings. And human beings were the most reliable cargo in the medieval world because there was always a market. The Norse built a town on the Irish coast, Dublin, and by around the year 1000, it was the busiest slave market in all of Western Europe, a place whose economy ran, openly, on captives. This is the register where the wry tone has to stop, because there is nothing clever to say about it. In the markets of that world, a captured man was valued at roughly 12 ounces of silver, a captured woman at around 8. That is a human life reduced to a line in an account book, and it was not a rare event or an excess of a few bad actors. It was the business. It was, for many voyages, the single largest thing the ship brought home. The second structural return was land empty or emptied ground in Britain, Ireland, the North Atlantic Islands, where the same ship that raided could carry a family and its livestock and simply stay, converting a raider into a landowner in one voyage. And the third return was the one that scaled the highest, because it didn't require fighting at all. It required only the credible threat of it. If your ships could appear anywhere, undefended and unannounced, a rich kingdom eventually did the math and offered to simply pay you to go away. The English called it, with resignation, the Danegeld. And the numbers on it are the clearest proof that this had stopped being raiding and become a business relationship. It started almost modestly 10,000 pounds of silver handed over in the year 991 to make a fleet go home. It did not make the fleet go home. It taught the fleet that England paid. So the price climbed. 16,000 pounds a few years on. 36,000 in 1007, 48,000 in 1012, after they had already sacked Canterbury and killed its archbishop. Across the reign of one cornered English king, the payments ran past 130,000 pounds of silver, and when a Danish king finally stopped negotiating and simply took the throne, he raised a last great geld of 72,000 pounds from the country at large, and another 10,500 from London alone. Feel the shape of that curve. It is not the jagged line of random raids. It is the smooth, rising line of a subscription whose price goes up at every renewal, paid by a nation that had been quietly converted from a target into a customer. But that same spectacular success is exactly where the crack opens, because a threat that profitable does not go unanswered forever. The very reach that made the ships rich was teaching the richer, more organized kingdoms on the receiving end a lesson. And what they learned would turn out to be the end of the whole model. Here is the turn, and it's the whole point, so slow down with me. We have been treating the Longship's great strength as one thing, and looking around for some separate weakness that eventually undid it. There is no separate weakness. Strength and vulnerability were never two things. They were the same mechanism, seen from opposite sides of a change. The thing that made the Longship unstoppable was that it turned the sea from a barrier into a highway. That is the strength. Say it plainly. A wall for everyone else became, for them, a road. But look at what a road actually is. A road is not a one-way valve. A road is a connection. And a connection, by its nature, runs in both directions. The same open water that let a small, poor community reach out and touch economies 10 times richer than itself was, the entire time, letting those richer economies reach back. And they were so much bigger. Every pound of Danegeld silver that flowed north was silver that a wealthy, centralizing English kingdom was learning to raise. Systematically, through taxation, building exactly the administrative muscle that would later be turned against the raiders. The plunder didn't just enrich the North. It functionally trained and funded the states that would eventually out-organize it. The settlements told the same story in reverse. The ship that carried a raider to a new coast to stay didn't produce more Vikings. It produced Normans and Anglo-Danes and Christian farmers, people who now owned land and who therefore wanted the sea to be a wall again, wanted the coast defended and the raiding stopped, because now they were the ones with something on the beach worth taking. The road that let them out was the same road that dissolved them into the places they arrived. And militarily, the openness that was pure advantage in a world of undefended coasts became pure liability the moment the targets organized, when the fortified bridge and the garrison town and the standing royal fleet made the surprise landing a death trap instead of a payday. The Longship never got worse. The world it had helped create got better at answering it. Now, let me be honest about how far this argument goes, because the strong version of a claim admits its own edges. Historians genuinely argue over the weight of each thread, whether Danegeld silver truly built the English tax state or merely sped up something already taking shape, how much of the assimilation was the sea's doing and how much the church's. The exact proportions are contested, and anyone who tells you they're settled is selling you something. But notice that the uncertainty is all in the proportions, never in the direction. On every axis, you can actually measure money, people, war. The openness runs both ways, and the richer end of the road always had more to send back down it. That is the law under all of it, the portable one. A tool that turns a barrier into a highway does not only let you out, it lets the world in. For everyone else, the sea was a wall, and for them, it was a road. And a road runs both ways. You can watch the whole thing come due on a single day. The date I seated at the start, 1066. Most people know it as the year of the Norman conquest of England. And it is. But the Viking Age has its own ending buried in that same year, a few weeks earlier and a few hundred miles north, at a river crossing called Stamford Bridge. A Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, as pure a longship warlord as the age ever produced, a man who had spent his life turning the sea into a road sailed for England with one of the last great raiding fleets on the old logic. The logic that had paid for 3 centuries, appear suddenly, with force, and take a kingdom. And the old logic failed, completely, because the thing on the other side was no longer a startled monastery. It was an organized English state that could raise an army, march it the length of the country at brutal speed, and meet the invasion in the field before it could consolidate. Hardrada was killed and his army was shattered, and the survivors, who had come in a fleet that reportedly needed hundreds of ships to carry it out, went home in a fraction of them. That is the reckoning made visible. The same open sea, the same fast ship, the same shock landing that had been an unbeatable formula run one final time against a world that had spent 2 centuries learning the counter, and it simply stopped working. And Stamford Bridge is only the loud version of the ending. The quiet version was happening everywhere at once, with no battle at all. In Normandy, the descendants of Norse settlers had already become French-speaking Christian lords, who would, within weeks of that same year, cross the Channel not in longships as raiders, but as a conquering feudal aristocracy with cavalry and castles. In the Danelaw, in Ireland, across the islands, yesterday's raiders were turning into taxpayers and bishops and farmers by the simple passage of a generation. The fleets shrank not only because they lost battles, but because one household at a time, fewer and fewer men had any reason left to build them. Notice what actually killed it. It wasn't a better ship. Nobody out-designed the Longship on the water. It was everything the Longship's own success had built on the other end of the road. The taxes, the armies, the fortified places, the centralized kingdoms that raiding silver had helped pay for, and the settlers who had quietly changed sides. The machine didn't break. The machine was answered by a world that had spent 300 years teaching how to answer it. And here's the part that makes it a tragedy, instead of just a story. Everyone involved was behaving completely rationally the entire way down. Nobody in the North made a stupid decision. Every single choice, taken on its own, was the smart one. For the individual Jarl, financing one more voyage was obviously rational. The returns were real, the shares were rich, and the alternative was staying poor on a cold farm while your neighbor got wealthy. For the individual crewman, signing on was rational for exactly the same reason. For the man who took his shares and bought land in the new country and settled down, that was the most rational move of all. It's what everyone was working toward. Security, ground of your own, a future for your children. But every one of those individually sensible choices was, collectively, a small payment toward ending the whole system. Each successful raid taught the target to organize a little more. Each Danegeld payment funded the tax machine a little further. Each settler who put down roots was one more former raider who now wanted the raiding to stop. There was no villain to blame, and no single hand on a lever anyone could have pulled to stop it. Because the thing dismantling the model was the ordinary, reasonable ambition of every person inside it. You cannot ask thousands of people to individually forego a fortune to preserve a system none of them can see whole. They didn't know they were the mechanism. They only knew the voyage in front of them looked worth it, and one at a time. For 300 years it usually was. So strip away the ships and the sheep and the silver, and here is what's left, the thing worth carrying out of this. The Vikings were never really an army, and the axe was never really the weapon. They were a small community that got its hands on a piece of technology that rewrote the basic maths of who could reach whom, and for 3 centuries that reach let them punch so far above their weight that the whole of Europe learned to fear a few thousand farmers from the north. But the reach was the strength, and the reach was the ruin, because the same connection that let them out let the world in, and the world was bigger. That's the pull that stays true long after the last Longship rotted. Anytime you find a tool or a technology or a strategy that turns someone's barrier into their private highway, look hard at the road, because the advantage almost never stays one way for long. The thing that lets you reach the world is the same thing that teaches the world to reach you. You can see the same shape everywhere once you have the eye for it. The trade route that carries your goods out carries a rival's army in. The network that lets a small company reach every customer lets every competitor reach those customers too. The opening is the exposure. They are not cause and effect. They are the same fact, wearing the face that suits the moment. The Vikings just happened to build the cleanest example the world has ever produced, a single wooden hull that was, at the same instant and for the same reason, the source of their power and the seed of their disappearance. Next time, we take another machine that everyone remembers as strong and find, again, that the exact feature everyone admired is the one that had its ending built in from the start. Because that's the pattern. What makes the machine strongest is almost always what's already killing it.